Origins of French Centralisation, and this is the Origins of French Centralisation by John Kraut. Is this about the recent video on France people have been making because France is like getting ready for war or something? If that's the case, yeah, it's going to be awesome to watch a Kraut video on it. Kraut takes a lot of philosophical element of things, right? Goes really deep into it, like what are the philosophy of things, what is the history of things, why certain thing makes sense when you really think about it, like long term and things like that. So yeah, Kraut is going to be awesome for this. But yeah, let's watch one. Remember, if you like my Rickson, don't like subscribe so that way I know which type of videos to react to more. I like videos like this, most like Kraut video as well, because Kraut is really unique in his way. Like I said, how he explain things and understand things based on a lot of philosophies and things. So yeah, it's different than other channels, right? Other channels tries to analyze based on geopolitics, military element, things like that. Kraut analyze it based on how historically things have been and things like that. So yeah, it's gonna be awesome. Let's watch it.
The sovereign state is an institution that is all around us, and it is a very tenacious means of social organization that has persisted through centuries and prevailed against many an ideological attempt to supersede, replace, or destroy it. The familiar story that we often like to tell high school students is that Europe was once a chaotic, pluralistic heap of feudal lords and religious authorities, maintaining systems of overlapping authority and accountability, built on a complex, interconnected system of faith and liege. But ultimately, above all of them, stood the idea of Christendom as a unified political mechanism for all. Then came the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, which killed the idea of a unified Christendom, followed by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the concept of the sovereign state by which we all now live. It is untrue, though. Yes, the 30 Years' War destroyed the political concept of Christendom. You will barely ever hear modern Christians use that word, because there is no unified Christian political space anymore. But the Peace of Westphalia did not create the sovereign state. It merely enshrined it. The sovereign state in Europe is the product of a very long political process. The beginnings of the sovereign state in Europe lie in France. In coming years, what happens in countries like Poland, Lithuania, Czechia, Hungary, and especially in Ukraine will become more relevant than it has been in decades. It will be more important to follow the news from these places to stay informed. This video is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is an app that I use when staying informed about what is happening in the world. Ground News gathers related news articles from around.
Yeah, well, go to ground.news/Kraut and support this channel, or go to original video page link from there, support it.
Access, or try it for less than $1 this month. Medieval France was the place where feudalism probably began, but also where it began to decline, mainly because of war. Medieval kings generally did not levy taxes, because kings owned large landholdings and estates from which they gained their revenue as private wealth. Medieval feudalism was a decentralized structure. The king granted aristocrats a patch of land with estates and peasants. Those nobles could then live off those estates and peasants in exchange for their loyalty. At this time, it was difficult to discuss whether there were capitals at all. Kings had various properties and residences. Governments could function wherever a monarch, his entourage, and his documents were. A Viking lord identified as Regenerus besieged and successfully occupied Paris, the capital of West Francia. However, both the Synod and King Charles the Bald just moved to other towns to organize the counterattack. Charles used Paris as a snare trap to keep the Vikings somewhere while an army to fight them was amassed, which goes to show that the West Franks could function very well without Paris. Beginning in the 13th century, the revenues from royal estates were no longer enough for the kings of France. Throughout 3 centuries, France found itself in a continuous state of war, driving the English out of France, getting involved in an English civil war, internal struggles with the Burgundians, the 100 Years' War, wars with the Spanish princes and kingdoms, crusades in Spain, crusades in North Africa, crusades in the Middle East, wars with the Holy Roman Empire, and wars with the Italian.
Oh my god, it is insane. Wars alone with England and France. When you see Wikipedia pages, the list is insanely long.
Princes. Sponsoring constant war drained the coffers of the kings and forced the kings of France to seek out different means of revenue. First, they started taxing merchants. Then, they gained papal permission to tax church lands for crusades. Afterward, France borrowed money from Jewish communities or the newly arrived Italian banks, only to then expel the Jews and jail the Italian bankers when it was time to pay up. But then, French kings went a step forward. They commissioned census collections. France counted how many lords, knights, estates, farms, and homes there were. France even tallied how many chimneys there were in the late 1200s. The king sent out accountants to collect this information. Then they returned to Paris, where there was a special room called the Chamber of Accounts. In that room, the records had to be laid out and presented on a...
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it is insane to think of it now, that there was a time where taxes didn't work like it's working right now, right? There's a tax for that. That's element applies to everything. But that wasn't the case one time. France basically, after all these war and things, had to think about all this.
big piece of brown cloth called labour. From that word, the room became known as le bureau, and henceforth the word bureaucracy became the loan word familiar to us in most of our languages. It was the bureau that began levying taxes on all sorts of things, like the chimney tax that had to be paid for each of those listed chimneys. Through this institution, French kings began bypassing the feudal hierarchy of liege. The monarchy began to gradually destroy feudalism to displace aristocrats as tax collectors. Now, the king took money from the peasants directly.
You see, back then, when you really think of tax, in a way, it kind of makes sense how stronger and the sovereign the state was. That's a question, right? Like, what type of things did this centralized monarchy or whatever provided for people? Nowadays, there's a tax for everything, but in turn, you get a lot of things. That's why there's a tax for everything. Tax has to pay for those things, otherwise it doesn't work. That's what that's sovereign state is, right? Basically, there's a tax for everything, but you get a lot of things from government. Roads, water, electricity, obviously the tax for that, but still you get a lot of service, defense, and God knows how many things, right? So back then with the monarchs, there wasn't so many tax, but people kind of had to take care of their own self, right? In a way, a lot of time people had to gather together just for a cause to do something in their own town, rather than relying on monarch or whatever local authority there is, right? But yeah, so when French started to do that, did they really think about all the aspect of things? Did they start providing for things or something like how we are doing right now? I'm pretty sure that's where it's going to lead, right?
Accountants, offices, paper trails, and archives to facilitate all these structures were built. These organizations increasingly resemble what we would call a central government. The new bureaucracy was very successful. The monarchy could field ever better armies while expanding its estates, which became the center of administration for the entire realm. The feudal chain of authority declined, and the powerful king with enormous administrative powers slowly replaced it. This built up the region of Île-de-France, the lands under direct rule of the ruling dynasty, and where a smaller Paris once was. The French nobility resisted this process of centralization. Much like Germany, France used to have a culture of city feuds and merchant towns closely identified with their local government. But then, war again helped the political development into creating the state. What helped facilitate the creation of a centralized French state in this time were the English, or to be more precise, the Battle of Agincourt. You probably know of this battle when the English completely shattered the armies of France in the Middle Ages. You may have once even heard the famous phrase, Flower of France, in the relation to this battle. This is because at Agincourt, the English killed almost all of the most powerful aristocrats of France, who famously rode into the English arrows on horseback, and this French defeat helped create the modern French state. Throughout Europe, political development at the time...
It's something, right? Like, the resistance is no longer there, so yeah, we can do this. Kind of makes sense, right? Think of like Holy Roman Empire, right? How effed up that was, because no one actually had real power, right? King didn't have much of a power in his own empire, right? It's like one of the best example of that, right? Something happened somewhere, who cares what king thinks? That was the element of that. So yes, centralizing this in France, obviously after death of so many people, obviously with some resistance. Yeah, this is kind of like modern version of things, right? In USA, states have a lot of power, but even that is like a federal government has the ultimate power in the end, right? It started as that, like, okay, federal and state has to like go work hand in hand. Over time, federal has gained power. I think it should over time, because that's how our world has become. That's how global economy is. There has to have a central power like that, central government.
And was dominated by power struggles between aristocrats and monarchs with varying outcomes. And what happened in France was Agincourt. It destroyed the leading aristocrats of France, and thereby, in a dramatic way, centralized an enormous amount of power in the French crown. This is when the development of a highly centralized and powerful French state really began to kick off. Short term, Agincourt may have been an English victory, but long term, it was a victory for the French king. The French monarchs came up with the most successful subversion of aristocracy in Europe, the court. The court of the Carpathian king was a highly ritualized and lavish institution where nobles would participate in ceremonies that projected their own political standing. All kingdoms had a court, but the French court was the most pompous and extravagant in Europe. This may sound like a silly, decadent and wasteful culture on first impression, but it's important to appreciate it for what it was, a public relations investment. French aristocrats would participate in rituals where they would dress the king, dine with the king, dance with the king, and in this increasingly centralized stratification of the state, closeness to the king meant closeness to Paris and its extensive administrative network. Regional aristocrats that used to compete.
This definitely didn't feed into all the French Revolution shit, right? All this is happening meanwhile some town in France.
To extract powers from the monarchy started to tussle over access to the monarchy. To ingrace themselves to the King of France, they surrendered power for favors and agreements that further solidified the position of the crown. If you visit the Palace of Versailles today, you as a 21st century person will essentially see a McMansion, a thrifty villa with gold-plated walls and dance halls full of mirrors so you can see yourself from every angle. But in the past, what a French noble would have seen was a display of Paris's extensive wealth and influence. You would see that the king could afford not only one but multiple mirrors for something as vain as a party room. The political function of Versailles was to communicate the extent of power of the French monarch and to imply it was better to be aligned to said powers than to be opposed. France began.
Yeah, same reason why certain companies have ridiculous things like, I don't know, like some kind of like a fountain in the center of things, basically implying, see, we have much better than what you have now. Same reason why some people buy when they get rich Range Rovers, because on that basically flexing, but flexing having a purpose behind it, not just flexing for the sake of flexing. There's a psychological purpose behind it.
Began a political development out of feudalism into what we call absolutism, a political system in which the powers of the state became increasingly centralized in the ruler of the state, with political power increasingly.
Basically similar how Donald Trump's lawyers are arguing about presidency of USA. Like, power has to be absolute and one centralized figure. No laws or nothing can really, like hold it back. Obviously, that's not how it works in USA, but there was never defined anything, so that argument is kind of working. But yeah, that's a scary element in itself. But yeah, that's what basically this absolutism of it is, I guess.
Condensing in Paris, while decentralized feudal structures prevailed in the rest of Europe, a French monarchy with a powerful army emerged by the 1400s, which by the 1600s was the dominant military power of Europe. In return, many European states consequently began to emulate and copy France. This is why French became the court language of so many European monarchies, and why so many European palaces are replicas of French Baroque and Rococo palaces. But you can learn French and build replicas of French palaces all you want. It wasn't buildings and language that made France the domineering power of Europe. It was the Parisian bureaucracy and the administrative apparatus around it that made everything happen in France. The Stuart dynasty failed at creating British absolutism due to the opposition of a more empowered British aristocracy. The even more powerful aristocracy of Poland took almost all powers from its king. The empowered peasantry of Scandinavia doomed the absolutism of its monarchs. The Holy Roman Empire was so culturally contingent and legally amorphous that establishing absolutism was impossible. The Habsburgs may have successfully established absolutism in their homeland in Austria and in Czechia, but they chewed their teeth out in the Hungarian aristocracy. The only places where absolutist copies were somewhat successful were Spain and Prussia, and the only place that managed not only to copy but even outdo France in creating absolutism was the Russian Empire. So far, we've discussed the consolidation of the bureaucratic state, but we've not yet described the sovereign state. Just because a state has managerial capabilities, it does not mean that those capabilities serve the people. European monarchies had a sovereign, but that sovereign was not any one person or institution in the country, it was God. A Christian king was the landlord of a landlord, in a way. They ruled God's kingdom in his name as foreman. The divine authority of a king was borrowed and oftentimes subject to the criticism and feedback of the papacy in Rome, which was indirectly responsible for healthcare, education, welfare, and academia. You might imagine how the absolutist French state also had incentives to struggle against the church. Louis XIV attempted to consolidate a national church, a French Catholicism that was bureaucratically separate from Rome. In 1682, Louis XIV attempted to consolidate a national church.
Yeah, the more I learn about this, the more I realize like how religion and politics became one. Right, separation of church and state wasn't even a thing because that was the point of it, right? And people were constantly battling Pope and Rome basically. At that point, like, okay, I have to, this is different from Vatican, let's do this. And everybody just, wait, what you trying to do there?
A French Catholicism that was bureaucratically separate from Rome. In 1682, Louis XIV made the proclamation that the French clergy should operate under Gallicanism, the idea that the king is as much an authority over the clergy as the Pope is. Before him, many French kings had attempted to influence popes, name alternative popes, and participate in papal wars. It was, however, not any one king, nor pope, nor conflict that solidified the French state as a sovereign institution separate from divine justification. It was the French Revolution.
When the revolutionaries got into power, they encountered that the obstacles to statecraft were the same as Louis XIV's. As such, the French Revolution intensified the struggle of the centralized state against both the clergy and the nobility. The Royalists and the Jacobins in the National Assembly debated how to code rights to freedom of religion in the new France. Oddly enough, the Jacobins had what we would consider today the more moderate position, a general statement of non-discrimination on the basis of creed. However, the Royalist faction of the Assembly did not agree. They, and especially the clerical faction within it, wanted to exclude Jews and Calvinists from positions of power. They saw a post-revolutionary France that was still a largely Catholic society, structured around churches, parishes, and congregations. The Jacobin proposal, though simple, dissolved religion as a relevant category for an individual to navigate society. That was unacceptable for the Royalists because, in their view, freedom of religion, if it should be a thing at all, should not threaten France's fundamental alignments with Roman Christianity. The National Assembly's debate over religious freedom was one of the messiest and worst documented ones we have, in part because everyone was screaming and the scribe could not make sense of big segments of it. What we ended up having out of it was a mess.
I mean, you kind of see that, like how they've been for years and they come to this point where they're arguing this. It's like, they let it build up all this time and it's just like, okay, let's talk about this, and everybody just loses their mind. I mean, can you just imagine right now being in that hall, basically just listening to all this shit, squabbling going around with that guy's like, what the fuck am I supposed to write now?
See amalgamation of the far left and far right positions that try to appeal to both the supremacy of the moral order and protections for all religions. Article 10 of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen reads, "No one may be disquieted for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their manifestation does not trouble the public order established by the law." But sit down with this statement for a minute and consider its implications. What this article and the wider philosophy around it is saying is that the extent to which you can act on your religion is subordinate to governmental policy doctrines. I can't stress how groundbreaking this is from a medieval perspective. This right is basically establishing the supremacy of French law over God's law. The article also ended up being the doom of...
Seriously, that is insane to think about at the time. Obviously, France, because of things like this, France is known for revolutionary things like that. But imagine that at the time. What did you say? You're bigger than God now. Is that what you're saying? Is the French state bigger? Selling that is like near insane. Like you need to have a lot of like talk, lot of discussion, lot of understanding with the people. Not like they have internet back then and they can just like send out tweet and just like have debates like that, online live debates on YouTube. They can't do that. So imagine like how to explain this to people. How is that gonna go, right? Like this is what's happening now. For years, centuries, basically millennia, right now centuries. For centuries, it has been like, okay, God is the top thing, everything comes below it, right? We are in God's kingdom. That's the whole point. And now, like, no, French state is bigger than everything else.
Of the clerical royalists, because by coding religion as a matter of individual morality, arguments from religion were rendered completely invalid in the French Congress. Christianity, being a collective good, became a personal perspective, which meant that appeals to Christianity could be both argued for and defeated rationally, and they often were. Even more, France would proceed to create the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790, a document that nationalized all church properties and revenues, abolished clerical orders, and created a French constitutional church, a church that was loyal and subordinate to French revolutionary edicts first and to Rome second. In this way, the revolutionaries created something that Louis XIV could not have even dreamed of. With this move, the French state grew even more. The government is...
I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? People like Louis, without this kind of a revolution taking on, how is it supposed to basically even tackle this? Once revolutionary thing has already been done, right? I mean, when you just like gone all in, by this point you need to have this kind of a radical and drastic steps, if it works or not. So it kind of makes sense.
Functions in bookkeeping and paperwork that had previously been the domain of the church. The French government could now issue civil birth certificates, civil marriages, civil obituaries, and many other types of files. This system was so efficient at generating records that today we have access to things like the names of individual hospital inmates in Lyon, 1793. We know their diseases, their state of health, their date of arrival, and we even have funding requests for special diets approved by
basically how we see things
the
now.
central government in Paris. To escalate even further, the public order understanding of Article 10 blew up on the clerical royalists. Its original intent was to exclude Protestants and Jews from the institutions of the state until Catholic priests were made to swear an oath to observe the civil constitution or become criminals in the eyes of the law. After the signing of the document, lots of French churches became illegal operations, and the persecution of these refractory priests marks the beginning of popular sovereignty in Europe in many ways. What France settled through these policies, retroactively called de-Christianization, was that it wasn't God, nor a king through God's permission, who justified the existence of the state. France, before any other European society in its time, stipulated that a popular government could be a self-justifying institution of the people, a country for the country, because the country wants it. Furthermore, the interests of the people and the church could be opposed, and in such instances, the people should have the final say. The civic constitution of the clergy would eventually be replaced with the Napoleonic Concordat of 1801, which gave back powers to the Pope while preserving various forms of French state control over church activity. Decades later, the Concordat itself would eventually be phased out of the French civil code, except in Alsace-Lorraine, where parts of it remain in the law. Modern France created milder and more direct laws separating church and state in the early 20th century, as the Jacobins originally intended. However, the impact and overall philosophy of these revolutionary laws is still with us. France's strong secularism can be traced back to the legacy of Article 10. When Muslims, and Muslim dress for example, are hounded and harassed in France over ideas of religion and the public order, that is no coincidence. The fact that it's even possible for France to discuss whether Muslim dress is something it should control, and not whether or not it can control it, is because the French government does have the reach to enter the lives of citizens. In other areas of life, the French government regulates that your pets must have tracking microchips inserted, the names you can give your children, that cafeterias and restaurants can't sell you unlimited ketchup, that the radio must have a minimum percentage of French language songs, that you can't be naked in your own home if you have a street window, and
Yeah, people are like, oh, you can do this, you can tell me this, you can tell me to wear this. We're French. Do you know what we are? Do you know what French state is? So basically, this is like how in US, basically there are things in place in USA trying to make sure state doesn't become too much, right? That didn't apply to France, obviously, because they were like doing all these things, right? So everything from the like name of the cat and everything French state is in it.
increasingly that there are types of swimsuit that you can and cannot wear at the beach. This is the less flattering part about a state as centralized as France. The bureaucracy can not only get incredibly difficult to navigate and negotiate with, it can also be used as a tool of political repression. The state itself is just a machine,
Obviously.
but the people in charge of the state are political agents by day's end. What they do and what they don't is subject to political interests. Napoleon III, for example, weaponized the centralized state to weaken his internal opposition. The long, wide boulevards you will see around the Arc de Triomphe were not built to better accommodate the car and the carriage, but to make crowd control an easier task for the police. That was an action of soft power of the French state against the French people, who wanted to get rid of the narrow streets people used to put up barricades. In other areas of public life, Napoleon III weakened the power of local bureaucrats and countables. By rendering them ineffective, he could position the Parisian central organs, and therefore his throne, as the only institution capable of solving problems. France has a network of high-speed rail called the TGV, and looking at the map of rail, you can observe how Paris is almost like a heart. Every road and every line connects to Paris. Paris is the reference point for travel, for work, for administrative services, and for urban life. And that
The infamous place, not infamous, the famous place in Paris, right? Where every road basically meets it, right? What is the name of that? I forgot. First time I think long ago I saw that in a video game or something like Saboteur or something. I don't exactly remember which video game. Was it Call of Duty? I don't know. But there's like that place where every road converges, right? So that's their mentality. So it wouldn't be surprising like every rail meets Paris, right?
concentration of resources can only manifest from there not being elsewhere in the country. There are universities in France without a college life because both professors and students prefer to live in Paris or commute. There are villages in the country where affordable travel by rail necessarily means taking a detour through Paris. Crédit Lyonnais, a now defunct bank founded in Lyon that was at some point larger than Deutsche Bank and Lloyds Bank, was not even based in Lyon. The directors moved the headquarters to Paris after just 19 years of activity
Makes sense.
in 1882. In a lot of real ways, Paris sucks the life out of the rest of France. A city that has about a fifth of the population of the country possesses 1/3 of the GDP, distributes all the tax revenue, and hosts the headquarters of most ministries and secretariats. This concentration of resources is normal for cities and even capitals, but the French scale is almost unparalleled anywhere else in Europe. It's no surprise that when the Gilets jaunes protests happened, people across the country traveled away from the localities and onwards to Paris to have their voices heard. The Palace of Versailles is an old heirloom France shows to tourists for fun these days. The museum shows people around the rooms and fanfare to display the excesses of an era of squander. But the fact is, the subtextual realities of Versailles are still very much with us. The Parisian court remains real in that access to Paris, proximity to Paris, is still a huge determinant in public, civic, and economic life. Something Americans might find strange about France is that French states' rights, you could call it, is a potent political force on the left. A little known fact about President Mitterrand is that he attempted but did not succeed at decentralizing the Parisian bureaucracy. Closer to the present, during the 2020 French general election, La France Insoumise and NUPES ran on a similar platform of territorial equality, justice, and rural improvement. which was code for let's divest revenue from the capital to the departments. The French generally like the services provided by the state, but that does not mean that the structure is without its criticisms or calls to reform. Emmanuel Macron and his party Renaissance have tried to make welfare more cost-effective through spending cuts, reductions, and restructuring, whereas Rassemblement National and Marine Le Pen want to minimize spending by making universal coverage more exclusive. All these may sound very absolutist to you, especially if you're American. I won't lie, from the perspective of quite a lot of French people, governance can be quite excessive and asphyxiating. At times, the only countries in Europe...
Yeah, but it's different, isn't it? US and France is different. Like you said, the way how France is structured, how this came to be, how Paris being center of everything, the way politics works kind of makes sense when you think about it. But yeah, there was a thing very recently, like the same how like Marie Le Pen, I think that's her name, right? That he said the other party was gonna win or something. Did the election happen? What happened to the latest election? When did it go, or it's like very soon or something? I don't know. But yeah, that she's gonna win or something. That was the case. I don't know. But yeah, obviously ideology is very different. How France would be if she wins? Would it be the same way it's going now? With how France is preparing for war and everything, will that stay the same? Because that's one of the things in the current political spectrum, right? USA is a great example of that. Two sides are so different. Whatever is in place, will that be same if like a new guy come in, right? So continuity in political, geopolitics of some country is like a really risky thing nowadays. Is that going to be the same thing with France?
Europe that had more people employed in the state were communist. But as valid as those reservations may be, the facts are that France has a longer life expectancy than the United States. French college educations are virtually free, as is access to healthcare on demand and childcare services for women. You can travel across the entire country without a car, and walking is a viable
Yeah, like he said, the centralization of things probably paves a way for something like this, because some decisions going to be absolute, or passing things like that in USA is nearly insane. Nobody's going to agree on anything, right? And in USA, there's a lot of wealth, but a lot of wealth is like wasted, right? There was a study that says like near 20-25% of food goes to waste. That's how much wastage is happening there. It's based on certain policies or something. I don't exactly remember. Same thing with like travel, education. Look at the education debt, right? What USA can do something to work around that. Of course they can, but because of like nothing is absolute in that way, state and federal power, there's always a struggle in Senate and things. Yeah, things are not going to move smoothly there. Well, France in the other side, like we've seen, like how there's lots of absolutes there with how centralization came to be, right? How things are working. Yes, some things like that is going to be better. Of course, life expectancy is better because a lot of obesity and things is higher in USA because of a lot of things. That's not going to be the case in France.
Form of travel in most cities. More recently, France became the first country in the world to legislate the right to abortion into the constitution less than 2 years after the repeal of Roe v. Wade. The French state can do all of this because it has a bureaucracy that is both willing and able to orient civic life, and a population that actively directs and monitors those bureaucrats. French society has always made its demands heard and its priorities known, both inside and outside the ballot box. An apathetic society with such an enormous state could look very differently, and not in good ways. In any case, France is very likely to continue being an activist society with an activist state. Future conversations about the bureaucracy will be about how to continue improving it. After all, effective welfare states don't only have to exist, but find ways to optimize. The bureaucracy must continue apportioning resources and facilitating coverage. In any case, France's 21st century challenges remain. Whether the centralized state can find a place in an increasingly globalized world, whether power and resources will ever be devolved from Paris to the rest of the country, whether it's possible for France to resolve key challenges with Ukraine, immigration, and polarization in its politics, are all questions that remain to be answered. French political discourse has been getting more divisive and intense, and most of these challenges are at the center of that. With European elections in 2024 and parliamentary elections in 2027, key decisions that will determine the future direction of the country will be settled this very decade. Hello.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? That's why, because of this centralization of things, how it's working in France, that's why you see way too many revolts and way too many like uprisings happening in France all the time, right? People even make jokes about like people revolting in France, but this is the reason behind it. How it's like how it's structured compared to something like USA or something. So some things you see of this will feel like, oh, look at that, they're getting shit done, like the things are getting better, right? While in places like US or something, nothing gets passed. But at the same time, it can also have like problems with it. That's why there like revolts and things happen, obviously. And with the modern world, right, every country is gonna face issues with like how like government's gonna work moving forward, because of how like economy is becoming like a global thing. Everybody's depending on each other. It's gonna rise up slowly, right? Economy. So certain places will have like things that you don't have. You're gonna have something that they don't have. So yeah, any sovereign state is gonna have issues like how to move forward. So in coming decades or even this century, a lot of issues gonna rise up, right? Like how to move forward with what type of government, what type of state, and how it's gonna play around.
Hello everyone, I am Ravignon. If you've been watching this channel over the past 3 years, you may know I am friends with Kraut and an artist for many of his videos. We've worked together for a long time and we've decided to create a collaboration again. For this script, Kraut and I split work on the research, and Von der Stroy and I from the Ravignon channel got through the art and the editing. If you'd like to learn more about the subjects we discussed, I recommend you check out Ian Kohler's Muslims and Citizens, John Merriman's Yale Lectures on France since 1871, and Marc Bloch's Feudal Society and the Ile-de-France. This video was made possible with the support of our Patreons. If you would like to help us create more content, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation through PayPal. If you would like to support us in other ways that aren't financial, you can subscribe, share, and like the video. Kraut, Von der Stroy, and I also have Discord servers and social media you can find in the description, where you can contact our communities and discuss the content.
Yeah, people, go to original video
Without
page
further
link,
to say,
and
thank you
from
for-
there, I guess, support this channel. This is a really good channel when it comes to philosophies and things, seeing things differently. I don't think I've come across other channels, at least at this scale, that is this good. It makes you think about things, obviously things like this, because how France is like getting ready for wars and things like that. This kind of like makes you think like how it's happening, right? How centralization France is helping that, how in the coming elections things are tide's gonna change or not, right? With Marine Le Pen and things like that. Obviously, Macron and her going toe to toe each other. That has been thing in past few elections as well, I think. But where is gonna go next? That's gonna be the question. And also like how Jeremy Clarkson's farm basically caused a revolt recently as well. Farmers revolt and things like that. So because of this centralization and how it's working, protest and revolt is kind of like central to French people, because there has to be that, right? Because this is not like USA, it's different. So there has to be revolts like that too. Basically, sometimes I can feel like, okay, nothing's getting done because of revolts and things. There are constant revolts. But sometimes it feels like, okay, this is kind of like a balancing thing. But yeah. Alright, well, if you like my next one, don't forget to subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you next time.